It's Matt, and today I'm going to be reading to you a very silly, nonsensical story. The name of this story is The Jolly Old Pretzel Chef, and I wrote it specifically for this video after learning about a podcast called Sleep With Me. I've not actually listened to it, but if I remember correctly, the podcast is supposedly a bunch of pointless stories that just kind of go nowhere. And because they kind of go nowhere and meander on, they help people zone out. So I thought I'd try something kind of similar for myself, although this one is especially weird. So just a fair warning ahead of time. It's a really stupid story. Either way, I hope you enjoy it. So let's go ahead and get started. Once upon a time, there lived a man named Harold. Harold was a fisherman. Not a portly one, mind you, but a slim, moss-colored one. That's right, Harold's skin was the color of moss. As the childhood victim of a genetic experiment gone wrong, Harold was cursed to look less like a person and more like a pale, moss-covered tree that had been living in the forest for over 300 years. However, Harold didn't mind this one bit. Why? Because Harold was in love with his uncle's pet chinchilla. Okay, get your mind out of the gutter. When I say love, I don't mean sexual infatuation. I mean love like one loves one's own brother. Like you'd love my own brother. Well, perhaps that's not the best example, as the vast majority of the human population has never met my brother. Speaking of which, have I told you about my brother? My brother is actually a slightly overweight hedgehog. Just like myself. We're both hedgehogs. Hedgehogs from the year 3042. You see, between the second and third millenniums, the rate of evolution increased rapidly, so much so that hedgehogs quickly attained a greater level of knowledge than humans around the year 2873. Thanks to the power of time travel, I've decided to come back to the primitive age of 2016 to tell you this story. Anyway, where was I? Oh yes, Harold. Harold and his brotherly love for an innocent, trustworthy chinchilla. Or so he thought. Unbeknownst to Harold, this chinchilla was the leader of a notorious multi-species gang known as the Towering Cockadoodle-Doos. The Towering Cockadoodle-Doos were comprised of animals of every species, from iguanas to toucans, and specialized in trafficking plumber's cheddar. Plumber's cheddar was not a type of cheese, you see, but actually a relatively new type of illegal intoxicant known as a digicotic. A digicotic was a type of drug that affected not the mind, but the various electronic apparatuses implanted into much of the population. Around 2986, the percentage of the population that had voluntarily become cyborgs surpassed the percentage that did not. And as you might expect, typical narcotics do not affect parts of the body not made of organic tissue. Thus, digicotics were invented and meant to be combined with traditional narcotics in order to help abusers attain an all-encompassing high. Without digicotics, the drug trips these cyborgs desired would not be attainable, as the computerized parts of their bodies would remain sober. Plumber's cheddar was one of the first widely produced digicotics. It came in the form of a metallic paste. Users would spread this paste across the circuit boards of their electronic appendages, inducing an immediate... You know what? Why am I even bringing this up? Drugs are bad, and that's all that needs to be said about that. So anyway, Harold loved this digicotic trafficking chinchilla, and he also loved hot dogs. In the year 2042, hot dogs went from a fast food staple to the center of a new religion. The religion was called sausagism, and as you can guess, it revolved around the worship of hot dogs. The holiest of hot dogs, known as bratwurst supreme, was first discovered resting peacefully under a pile of Spanish flashcards in a Georgia garbage dump. People would travel from all over the world just to catch a glimpse of bratwurst supreme. The fanaticism over bratwurst supreme was so extreme that people waiting in line for their opportunity to view it would often murder those who'd arrived before them, simply to shave a few seconds off their wait time. But one day, an 8-year-old boy from Kenya picked up Bratwurst Supreme. Those in the immediate vicinity stood breathless, unable to decide how to react for several seconds. But by the time those several seconds were up, the boy had already finished eating the holy hot dog. One would expect the mob to eviscerate the boy, but instead, he was exalted and became the new center of sausagism. The boy, whose birth name was Baraka, was from then on named Bratwurstio. As Bratwurstio aged, his delight with the title slowly turned to disgust. Bratwurstio did not want to be Bratwurstio anymore. However, Bratwurstio realized that his status could be exploited. At the age of 28, Bratwurstio established Realitog, a virtual reality entertainment network dedicated to sausagism. Realitog transformed sausagism into a booming business, monetizing every aspect of the religion. The most profitable product created by Realitog was a hot dog costume for tortoises. You see, by the year 2050, the humble tortoise had surpassed cats and dogs as the most popular pet on Earth. They were especially popular among sausagists, as they were much less likely than cats or dogs to consume the hot dog-based shrines constructed in their homes. Now, what does all this have to do with Harold and the chinchilla, you ask? Well, absolutely nothing. Anyway, Harold woke up one day and noticed something odd. In the place of his usual pillow was a travel-sized tube of toothpaste, mint-flavored. This was particularly odd because Harold strongly disliked the taste of mint and had nothing but plain flavored tubes of toothpaste in his home. Suspecting an overnight burglary, Harold reached under his bed and grabbed his favorite defensive weapon, a baseball bat covered in barbed wire named Lucille. At this point, some of you may recognize this item from an entertainment franchise called The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead is a comic series and television show based on a group of people trying to survive the zombie apocalypse. While new issues of the comic are still being produced in 3042, the television show was actually canceled in August 2016. Harold was aware of neither. Grasping Lucille firmly in his hands, Harold slowly examined the house for any sign of forced entry. He found none. He did, however, find a pristine, mint-condition pack of Yu-Gi-Oh cards sitting on his toilet seat. That's odd, Harold thought to himself. I could have sworn I left Pokemon cards there last night. He pocketed the Yu-Gi-Oh cards, shrugged off the two oddities he had encountered, and decided to prepare for work. After a hearty breakfast of chicken tikka masala, Harold grabbed his car keys and opened the front door, expecting to see his car in the driveway, but he did not. Instead, he found himself peering through a portal, just like the ones imagined by 21st century science fiction writers. Feeling no fear whatsoever, Harold stepped into the portal and closed the door behind him. Now, you might be wondering where this portal went. Well, to answer your question, this portal actually went straight to his driveway. Or more specifically, an alternate universe version of his driveway in which his car was not parked. Harold felt no fear stepping through the portal because he did not realize he was even stepping through one. Instead, he felt a strong sense of anger, believing that his car had been stolen. Suddenly, Charles transformed into a small avocado. Charles was Harold's next-door neighbor, but he would not be missed by Harold because they had never met. Charles transformed into an avocado. In the universe Harold had woken up in, the universe Harold had just stepped into, and nearly every other alternate universe in which he existed, aside from a small cluster of alternate universes in which avocados did not exist. Charles was a jolly old man whose profession was pretzel making, but whether or not his career would survive the transformation had yet to be seen. At this point in the story, it is necessary for me to mention that Harold had severe memory problems. Although his memory was really quite good in most ways, the slightest atmospheric changes could wipe out massive chunks of it. Not all atmospheric changes had this effect, but the small percentage that did could cause a catastrophic memory loss. Unfortunately, Charles's transformation into an avocado decreased the nearby atmospheric pressure just enough to trigger Harold's condition. Within a split second, Harold's anger turned to confusion. He had completely forgotten about his missing car, the Yu-Gi-Oh cards in his pocket, the reason he'd stepped outside, and the sunglass-wearing octopus that had woken him up 2 days earlier by screaming profanities at him in Vietnamese. In fact, Harold had forgotten that he owned a car in the first place, and he had also forgotten how to walk like a normal human being. He panicked, unsure of how to get to where he was going. But first, he had to figure out where that actually was. Harold focused very hard. Where should I be going? He thought to himself once, then twice, then 37 times. Finally, after repeating the phrase in his head 426 times, an answer popped into Harold's mind in the form of a small imaginary leprechaun. The leprechaun winked at him, snapped its fingers, and then whispered, "Disney World." Now he had to figure out how to get there. Trying his hardest to remember how to move, Harold looked around frantically, scanning for moving objects to learn from. The first moving object he saw was a Pontiac Aztec, but he could not imitate its movement because he did not have wheels. The second moving object he saw was an Apache helicopter, but he could not imitate its movement because no matter how hard he tried, he was unable to rapidly twirl his hair in circles like a propeller. Finally, he noticed a snail crawling along Charles's driveway and immediately knew what to do. Harold threw himself on the ground and, as slowly as possible, began inching himself down the driveway like a large, somewhat fashionable worm. Harold anticipated that this mode of transportation would get him to Disney World in approximately 45 minutes, but he could not be more wrong. 45 minutes was an incredibly inaccurate estimate for several reasons, especially at the pace he was moving. The most important of these reasons was the area in which he lived. For those unaware, Disney World is in Orlando, Florida. But where did Harold live? Orlando, Florida. Across the street from Disney World, to be precise. You see, by the year 3042, overpopulation had become one of the biggest problems in the universe. Although Disney's investors were very reluctant to allow it, real estate companies decided to construct entire neighborhoods within inches of Disney property. With this move, realtors hoped to reel in ridiculous amounts of money, while flaunting their efforts as a partial solution to overpopulation. But more importantly, some of them just wanted to live across the street from Disney World. As I was saying, Harold's estimate was terribly inaccurate. His commute did not take 45 minutes. It took 3 minutes and 52 seconds. Upon his arrival, he stood up, spent a calm moment observing a nearby restroom sign, glanced at a dragonfly perched on a stroller, and finally decided he did not want to go to Disney World anymore. At this exact moment, the avocado that had once been Charles became sentient, lamented his recent transformation, and thought to itself that it would be much happier if it had transformed into a lime instead. And 4 seconds later, Harold decided he'd rather go to Disneyland. After all, their version of the Haunted Mansion was far superior. So he threw himself to the ground, took a deep breath, and began to slowly inch himself towards California. Meanwhile, Harold's favorite chinchilla was preparing for what was sure to be the largest gang war the towering cockadoodle-doos would ever be involved in. Donning his favorite fedora, the chinchilla, whose birth name was Reginald, hopped onto a tricycle and began pedaling towards the home base of the Tunnel Snakes, a violent rival gang made up entirely of 4-legged lizards. The Tunnel Snakes desperately longed to rid themselves of pesky limbs, but not a single member had the testicular fortitude required for cutting one's own legs off. However, even if they were to try, the so-called Tunnel Snakes would never be able to live up to their namesake, because several thousand years of evolution had granted them the ability to grow back removed limbs anyway, and this process was completely involuntary. The Tunnel Snake's home base happened to be a large bucket sitting in a janitorial closet just outside Disneyland's Haunted Mansion. Reginald lived in the humble town of Napoleon, Ohio, inside a small, rust-covered, dilapidated shed under an unhealthy eucalyptus tree, next to a porcelain statue of a bear, approximately 3.5 feet away from an awfully misleading "Beware of Dog" sign in Harold's uncle's backyard. When I say that this "Beware of Dog" sign was misleading, it was not because Harold's uncle did not own a pet dog, it was because he owned two. If the sign was accurate, it surely would have read "Beware of Dogs" instead. Anyway, Reginald knew that the trip from Ohio to California would be a long one. Accordingly, he packed the following food items to nourish him throughout the trip: a large bag of peanuts, 2 tins of caviar, a half-eaten cheeseburger from Shake Shack, 12 bananas, a freeze-dried cheese omelet, a chocolate chip muffin, a blueberry muffin, a bran muffin, a banana nut muffin, 2 dozen Krispy Kreme donuts, 7 heads of lettuce, every flavor of smoothie offered in Jamba Juice, a box of fruit roll-ups, a slightly larger box of fruit by the foot, a significantly smaller box of fruit-flavored gummies, cheese, crackers, 9 servings of chicken piccata, 1 miniature corn on the cob, some s'mores-flavored Pop-Tarts, the ingredients required to make actual s'mores for a family of 5, a medium pizza from Little Caesars, a medium pizza from Pizza Hut, a medium pizza from Domino's, a medium pizza from Papa John's, an extra-large frozen DiGiorno pizza, 2 apples, 6 brownies, a jar of chocolate chip cookie dough, a handful of McDonald's fries, and finally, 1 Pringle. But it was not enough. Only 3 hours into the trip, Reginald had exhausted his entire food supply, and he began to starve only 15 minutes later. But thankfully, just as he was beginning to lose hope, Reginald stumbled upon a sight he'd never forget: Harold, inching slowly across the ground like a worm. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure how Harold ended up in Ohio, but I suspect it may have had something to do with portals like the one we saw earlier. Reginald shrieked with joy, thankful that one of his best friends had appeared to save him from death by starvation. Harold heard the incessant rumbling of Reginald's chinchilla stomach and reached into his pocket to find some food to offer him. But all he could find was a single grain of rice. Reginald settled for it, and by the luck of some miracle, the single grain would sustain him for the entire trip. Because they were both headed to Disneyland, Reginald gave Harold a ride, greatly reducing his travel time. Knowing that Harold would frown upon him if he was to learn about his gang affiliation, Reginald pretended to be going to Disneyland for leisure. After a few weeks, they finally arrived, but not before Harold thought to himself that if his life story was ever to be retold in the form of a softly spoken and/or whispered YouTube video, he would very much prefer the thumbnail to be a photo of an anonymous Indian man enjoying a beer. In order to hide his true intentions, Reginald explained to Harold that he had come to Disneyland solely to do some people watching. Harold understood Reginald's desire for solitude, decided to leave him alone, and left to go ride Pirates of the Caribbean. Once Harold was gone, Reginald turned to look where he imagined a camera might be, had this been a movie, twisted his face into a sinister stare for a moment, and then departed towards the haunted mansion. The tunnel snakes had just finished their daily lizard yoga session when Reginald knocked on their bucket. Slithering out of the bucket as sneakily as 4-legged lizards could, the tunnel snakes surrounded him. Then they began to chant their catchphrase: "Tunnel snakes rule! Tunnel snakes rule! Tunnel snakes rule! Tunnel snakes rule!" Reginald was not intimidated by this brash display. Instead, he simply drew his revolver, pointed it at the leader, and said, "Give me all your lunch money." They all stopped chanting. The leader, whose name was Tom, laughed heartily at this request. "What are you gonna do? Shoot me?" he asked. Reginald's response was simple. He nodded, pulled the trigger, and shot Tom in the head. But unbeknownst to Reginald, Tom's skull had recently been coated with Kevlar. The tunnel snakes all laughed, and Tom began to We pissing our pants yet? Boy, do I have a feeling we're getting close. Yep, gonna be pee-pee pants city here real soon. And just as Tom finished his sentence, Harold's boat drifted through yet another portal, out of the simulated Caribbean and into the janitorial closet. Everyone in the room stared at each other in shock. At that moment, Harold, Reginald, and Tom all had sudden realizations. Harold realized that his favorite chinchilla was in fact a notorious gangster. Reginald realized that Tom was just like him. And Tom realized that he'd forgotten to brush his teeth that morning. Let me explain what I mean when I say Reginald realized that Tom was just like him. Not only was Reginald a gangster, but he was a time traveler as well. From the year 2016 to be exact. You see, in July 2016, Donald Trump invented time travel. How this happened remains a mystery to this day, but the fact remains that it happened. And as you'd expect, criminal organizations were quick to take advantage of the new technology. By traveling into the future, gangs were able to see what fate had in store for them, and accordingly they would travel to the moments of pivotal events in order to ensure the best possible outcomes. This was an addictive process, and Reginald had been traveling further and further into the future, with the intention of helping his gang reign supreme for the rest of time. However, the fact remains that he'd begun time traveling in July 2016, and happened to be a huge fan of The Walking Dead at the time. Upon Tom's mention of Pee-Pee Pants City, he recognized the taunt as a line ripped directly from a 2016 episode of the show, and realized that Tom must have been a time traveler as well. So what'd you think of the Season 6 finale? Reginald asked. The Season 6 finale of what? Tom asked, immediately recognizing which show he was talking about. You know what, asserted Reginald. And indeed, Tom knew exactly what, but his mind had been so thoroughly blown by the question that he had to get more proof that Reginald was just like him. But when Tom had finished pronouncing the word of, the atmospheric pressure change caused by his breath triggered Harold's condition, and this time, instead of losing his memory, Harold regained it. In a split second, Harold remembered everything he had ever learned, and when Tom replied to Reginald with, "The Walking Dead?" Harold knew exactly what needed to be done. You see, Harold had a very unique job. He worked at what was called the Television Protection Society. The Television Protection Society was tasked with ensuring the cancellation of various TV shows, whatever the reason may be, and their employees, including Harold, were frequent users of time travel. And it just so happened that Harold's current assignment was the cancellation of The Walking Dead, as requested by a filthy rich fan of the comics, who was underwhelmed by Season 6's finale. So he reached into his pocket, pulled out his pebble-sized time travel device, and jumped back to August 2016, disappearing from the janitorial closet in an instant. Upon realizing their shared love for The Walking Dead, Reginald and the Tunnel Snakes agreed to put their differences behind them. Harold reappeared a moment later, announced that the show had been cancelled, and instantly became the enemy of two powerful time-traveling gangs. To this day, Harold remains at the top of the criminal underworld's hit list, and is currently hiding away in a secluded shed in New Hampshire. As for Charles, well, he somehow managed to develop telekinetic abilities, and happily continues working as the only avocado on Earth capable of making pretzels. And that, my friends, is how AMC's The Walking Dead was cancelled. And that is it. I have to admit that story sounds even dumber reading it out loud, but I do hope you enjoyed it. If you want more stuff like this, please let me know, because it was definitely fun to write, and I wouldn't mind trying some more. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good night's sleep.